Hello, good morning. We'll start in 2 minutes with this amazing talk with Daniel. Perfect. Good morning or good afternoon, depending of the city. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful day. Today we have Daniel Brown with us talking about the cost of the cloud. And Daniel Brown is a thought leader specializing in the delivery of cloud architecture and DevOps solutions. As the resident AWS expert at Improving Atlanta, he loves to discuss the implementation of Amazon services. He is passionate about finding the practical path and controlling cloud costs. Today, he is going to break down the complicated cloud pricing models and the listener's framework to proper count the cost of the cloud. Welcome and thank you.
Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay down the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees will ridicule you. Luke 14:28-29. Hi, I'm Daniel Brown. I'm a solutions architect, senior consultant at Improving. I have certifications from AWS. There's even a couple that I have that are expired right now. Also have one from GCP. I'm a DevOps engineer, avid gardener, and particularly in gardening, carnivorous plant enthusiast and hobbyist. Okay, so why cloud costs? So I've been part of a lot of migration projects, and usually it's migrating. Oh, is there something on the chat? Oh, sorry. Usually it's migrating from AWS to or migrating from data centers locally to AWS. That's mostly what I've been part of. And I've heard a lot of rhetoric like, okay, Daniel, we got to get everything out of our local data center. We're going to move it to AWS, lift and shift. We don't care what the cost is, just put it in there. We'll worry about refactoring and thinking about costs later. But I contend that the best thing you can do, if possible, is to do a little bit of planning and understand what you're getting into. It might be that if you have a local data center, it might be costing you $1 million a year to run it. So, okay, you're probably going to save money going into AWS. However, I've heard the opposite too from clients. I had one guy that was a network engineer that I knew pretty well, and he was a pretty sharp guy. And he predicted that one day we would start seeing people leave the cloud and go back to the local data centers. And it might be a data center run by the company, or maybe a colo location run by a third party where you're just renting rack space. But I thought that was a very odd thing, because all of the trends and everybody's saying, oh, go into the cloud. We don't want to manage our own hardware. But I think there's been enough people that have been burned by high cloud costs that are thinking, you know what, maybe we should have never left our own data center. Maybe we need to go back. In my opinion, it doesn't need to be that way. In my opinion, if you do some proper planning and change your mindset, being in the cloud can be very affordable in the sense that you don't have to have armies of ops people to help you be in there. You don't have to manage anything. You don't have to worry if a RAID drive goes out or something like that. Because if you know, in the cloud provider worries about that, and they move your software to another piece of hardware, and sometimes almost seamlessly that you don't even know what's happening. So my idea is that, yes, move to the cloud, but be more informed about it. Think about why you want to go to the cloud. Think about what it's going to cost you to go to the cloud. This is the problem, though, is so many people have had these horror stories, you know, about running up, you know, a $65,000 bill on AWS. You know, this one guy DDoSed himself using CloudFront and Lambda Edge and got a $4,500 bill. You do run into a lot of students and hobbyists that are stuck with these big bills because they didn't know what they were doing and they went in there. But this kind of thing happens with enterprise people also. You know, you put everything into the cloud and then all of a sudden it's a $90,000 bill and you're thinking, what did we do? We're just running a couple servers, maybe a database, some things. Why are we presented with a $90,000 bill? That's crazy. Of course, these horror stories are kind of like urban legend in some ways. But the truth is who even talks about, I mean, who even's responsible for the bill? Is it the people with the purse strings, the people in accounting? Is it the developer that's writing the software? Do you have operations people that are responsible for it? I mean, in an old data center, you would go out and buy a bunch of hardware, bring it into the data center, and then the people would use it. So whoever was buying the hardware and provisioning the hardware and building the architecture for that, they were kind of had a real responsibility for this. But in a time where we have DevOps people, developers deploying code directly to the cloud, we have to kind of change how we think about that. So how do we bring sanity to the problem? I contend that we need to educate IT and the business on how cloud is priced. I think the people that really understood what it costs to run an IT solution, to run an enterprise solution in the old days, were the people that were running the data center, and then also the people in accounting that would sign the checks, but maybe they didn't really understand what that was. We've eliminated operations people a lot in big part. Hold on a second. One thing I see that's a problem is, and especially with a lot of the DevOps movement, and I see this as a DevOps engineer, somebody that's in the trenches looking at this, is we've often eliminated a lot of ops people. We said, we're moving to the cloud so we can just lay off all our operations people. We'll just have the developers figure it out. That's not going to be the right way to do it. You still need people that are going to be thinking about operations, and it's not going to be the guy writing the code necessarily. I think you really mitigate disaster with good planning. I think performing cost forecasting on future projects, I think that's the way to go. I think continually auditing and monitoring monthly costs is a good thing. We ought to be doing a review every month, say, oh, okay, we got slightly more traffic the last month than this month, and that caused our bill to go up 30%. Ugh. Is there something we can do to refactor, to rethink about that? Really, the main thing is the variable costs in the cloud. So you really have to do some kind of forecasting with it. You have to think about how are we going to pay for this? What's it going to cost? Because the costs aren't necessarily fixed. Even if you get something like a virtual machine that you're running, how much does it cost to run this EC2 instance in AWS for a month? Well, it depends. There's a fixed cost associated with it, but there's other things. I think using calculators, reports, pricing lists, making yourself familiar with these management tools, all that kind of stuff is very important to trying to count the cost of the cloud and bring sanity to the problem of not knowing what it costs. So I'd like to propose, so really I want to give you guys a framework to think about how the cloud is how its costs are broken down. So I have what I call the 6 different categories of cloud computing. These are the 6 different cost models, is how I put it. So let me just go into them. I'm going to go over them individually, but let me kind of show you all of them once here. Okay, the 6 cloud cost models. These are the ways that cloud providers charge you: time, work, transport, storage, licensing, and then there's something that I'll call free services. Now let's dig into them and let's think about how this works. Okay, cost model time. Basically, in the cost model for time, you are paying to lease an asset. The cloud provider has something, they lease it out to you to use it. So this could be like a virtual machine. So if you had a Windows box with 4 CPUs and 8 gigabytes of RAM that's running on a cloud provider, they'll lease that out to you and say, this is your Windows box. And then maybe it has a 100 gigabyte hard drive or something. I don't know. They'll say, hey, this is your Windows box, lease it out to you, use it. And they're charging you basically for time. They're charging you for how long the lease is. So if you use it for a week, they'll charge you for a week. They'll use it for an hour, they'll charge you for an hour. A lot of the cloud providers have where they'll give you pricing up to the second. So if you only use it for, say, an hour and 1 second or something, they'll charge you only for the 1 second. They won't round up to the next hour. But anyway, it is really up to you as the consumer of this time asset to really make the best use of that asset while you're renting it. So if the machine is kind of, say, idle over the weekend, you're still paying for that because you're still renting that machine over the weekend. A lot of times what people will do with, say, virtual machines is they'll shut them down when you're not using them. And in most cloud models, you're not paying for it anymore when you shut it down. So that's a good way to save money because you're cutting down on the time. You shut it down on the weekends, that's Saturday, Sunday, Saturday, Sunday, Saturday. We're talking 8 days that you're not paying for. Pretty good. Okay, let's go to the next cost model. The next cost model is what I'll call the work cost, the work model. This is pay per task. The cloud provider sells units of work to the cloud consumer. You only incur costs when the task completes. Or, if it's a build or something that the task fails, it completed, it's just not in a favorable result for you, right? Okay, so things like cloud functions, like Lambda in AWS, or functions in Azure, because Azure names everything like what it is, and AWS has all these weird names. I say this as an AWS person. But also things like messaging queues, monitoring alerts. So if you have an alarm set in CloudWatch, you could be paying for the work on that alarm going off. Though I think actually that one is one that you pay by time. ML AI functions. So here's a good example. If you're using a cloud service that does OCR. You're sending a document over to it, a document that's been scanned, and you say, hey, can you tell me what characters are actually on there? Can you translate this image, this TIFF maybe, to text? You maybe get charged per document on that. So that would be a per task charge. Authentication requests are a good one. So one like Cognito. So say you had a mobile application and somebody logged in and did an authentication handshake. It's very likely that how your cloud prices it is they may charge you so many cents per million authentication requests. That would be a per task work charge. Okay, so work or per task. Transport. Usually this is a cost associated with gigabytes in motion is what I kind of put it as. And it's for moving data over a network. So it could be over their network. It could be from one data center to another. AWS has regions and availability zones. So it might be that you get charged for moving from one region to another. It might be that you get charged for moving data out of a network. So it's in the AWS network, internal network, but to push that data out to you, you may get charged for it. So examples may be like database data. You query something, it goes out to you, or you're pulling a report, say, from your local machine. That data may be charged an outcharge. Real-time data processing is one that is a very good example. If you have a stream of data that you're wanting to ingest into S3, saying use something like Kinesis, that would be something that they would charge for transport, the data transport charge. Data processed through a NAT gateway. A NAT gateway is a virtual appliance in AWS. And by the way, I'm trying to make this cloud agnostic, but what I really know the best is AWS. All of these things pretty well apply to the major cloud providers. There's exceptions, but I think this way of thinking of it's still pretty correct. So a NAT gateway would translate data from a private subnet to the public subnet out to the internet. And you're going to pay costs associated with the transport of that data. Okay, storage. Pay by gigabyte stored. The cloud provider charges by bytes stored. Beware, not all bytes are equal. Okay, so this is one of those things that get people really frustrated about the cloud is you think, oh, well, how much is it to store 1 gigabyte? Depends. What does it depend on? Depends on where you're storing it. So if you are storing it in S3 or blob storage or some kind of key value pair storage, it's usually pretty cheap. And it can get even cheaper if you use a less available version of it. So like Glacier and Amazon S3. So one that it's like, we're putting this in long-term storage. We're not going to be able to access it on demand. We have to make a request to access it. Gets really, really, really cheap to archive data. However, disk storage for VMs, more expensive. So 50 gigabytes stored in key value pair, pretty cheap. 50 gigabytes on a disk and a VM, more expensive for sure. Database storage, very expensive. I don't know, for whatever reason, the database stuff always seems to be the most expensive. But yeah, it could even be the hardware they're putting it on and stuff for durable block storage. But the virtual machines have that too. Anyway, expensive. log storage. So log storage may be stored in S3, but it may be stored in other things. That's maybe not as obvious. It may be backed by S3, but you need to, if you're storing any data anywhere, you need to look to see what it's actually costing you, because don't assume that just because it's backed by S3 or that it's a certain type of data storage that you know what it costs, because you may not. Also, just on something like virtual machines, you could have different hard drive types, and that might affect your cost storage. So faster hard drives, more money. Slower hard drives, less money, but also you get a hit with performance. Okay, so let's talk about the next one. The next cost model that the cloud uses is called licensing. Pay for software licenses. AWS has a lot, and Azure and all the cloud providers, they have a lot of third-party vendors that have made hay on basically running their software on these cloud providers. And there's a whole bunch of logos on the back there. Huh, interesting. Microsoft's one of the logos I put in there. It might be that Microsoft's actually running Windows machines in AWS. So even though Microsoft has their own cloud provider in Azure, they're still making money as a third-party vendor in GCP, in AWS, for licensing on Windows and also licensing on SQL Server. Okay, so these licensing costs are usually services that are outside of AWS, but they're available through the marketplace, or you can even buy them separately and run them in AWS. But there's something that needs to be accounted when you're thinking about costs of your cloud solution. I guess you could say, hey, this is everything AWS is billing us, and this is what Sumo Logic is billing us. But really, it's all one cloud bill, and it needs to be accounted for if you're thinking about it. Okay, so examples could be Windows VMs, Oracle databases, Amazon firewalls. So I did put Fortinet over here, and Palo Alto, Nginx for web server, Trend Micro for antivirus stuff, Sumo Logic, Splunk for monitoring type stuff. You could even be paying Chef things for infrastructure or configuration management stuff. Yeah, so licensing, I think, would be the one of the top things. Okay, let's get into one of the cost models that I think is the diciest and really almost makes me a little bit angry about the cloud solutions. Cost model, free services. You pay for question. Okay, so in Amazon, you have a free tier that is 25 gigabytes for the DynamoDB per month. You get 25 gigabytes for free. You get 1 million Lambda requests for free. And these are the free all the time, I think. And so, yeah, okay, so let me explain what I mean by dicey. There's certain things that you get for free during your 6-month introductory to Amazon, or some of these are. And then there's things that are always free. And then there's things that are free that are like these glue services. I call them glue services. I shouldn't say glue because there's an AWS glue. So let's say building type services. So things like CloudFormation, that's an infrastructure as code, a home-baked infrastructure as code solution for AWS. Elastic Beanstalk, which is a solution that allows you to basically deploy your code without knowing what all the underlying resources are, having to manage those. Those services are free, but you pay for what you build. So if I were using CloudFormation to build a Kubernetes cluster, I'm paying for the Kubernetes cluster, but I'm not paying for the instructions on executing it. I would say in the case of infrastructure as code, it's basically like it would be equivalent to trying to pay for, using the command line or using the console. I mean, obviously, why would you do that? You're just using it to invoke something, to build something. So those services are always going to be free services. And then there's one called freemium type services. These are free at the basic level and pay for the advanced level. So AWS Shield is a good example. It is something that is absolutely free. And it comes with all of your, I think WAF solutions, I believe is where it's attached to. I'm trying to think if it's WAF or load balancer. I think it's WAF. And there is actually an advanced version that you can get, and it's significantly more, but it's something that you can get to enhance your ability to block malicious traffic. For AWS Shield, I think it's mostly for DDoS type stuff. Though you get a pretty good protection with the basic level. If you need advanced level, then you get that. Or you could go back and get the third-party solution, get something like Cloudflare. But we're talking about these services here. Okay, so all right. Let me kind of go. Let me go off on a little bit of a rant. How much time we got? Oh, we got plenty of time. Okay, so the free tier. I like the free tier because it's basically, there's services that are always free. I think I started to get into this, but so the DynamoDB stuff, the Lambda requests, always free. For your first 12 months, sorry, not 6, 12 months, you get 750 hours of EC2 time and 5 gigabytes of S3 time. And for something like SageMaker, you can get 2 months free of SageMaker, then they start charging you. GuardDuty is the same thing. GuardDuty is a kind of a security auditing software that's in AWS, and they'll basically give you a month free of GuardDuty, and then you have to pay for it after that. So the problem I have with the free tier services is it really lulls people to sleep, thinking that, oh, well, these are free services. As long as I stay below this threshold, I'll be fine. And it is true and it isn't true, because you get past that trial, 12 months of free services, then you start paying after 12 months and 1 day, you start paying. These free services, if you have a Lambda function that is hitting 1 million requests, you're fine. You start hitting more than that, you're going to pay something. Now, Lambda's not that expensive, but these are things you have to stay on top of, and especially if you're trying to make a very cheap solution or free solution in AWS, you have to be a master to be able to really master this free tier. I know people that are. There's a lot of guys that are running all kinds of interesting things using just the free services, but most of what we're talking about today is for enterprise solutions. So okay, all right. So so we got these 6 cost models here, but here's where it gets interesting. Where it really gets interesting is when we start introducing combinations, because no service is one thing, of course. So let's look at a couple of these combinations. Okay, so relational database service. I always talked about this. And by the way, if you're new to cloud solutions, let me just tell you a secret. This is just the most expensive thing is always the database. Always the database. I mean, maybe if you're running some machine learning stuff, okay, but for most people, it's the database. So you need to pay particular attention to database costs. Okay, so for relational database, say you're running SQL Server. The cost models for SQL Server are going to be time, licensing, which is in AWS is included in time. So it's so much to run a SQL Server for an hour. Database storage. So how many gigabytes do your tables take up, your rows? Backup storage. Well, of course you can't have a database without backing it up. So you're going to create these snapshots, and how much does that cost to store? Well, how big are they? Transport. So you have to pay for data that goes outside of your VPC. That's included in the cost, or that's something else that gets charged in the cost. So we're talking relational database, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different cost models of the 6 implemented are included in that. And you could maybe take out licensing if you wanted, because it's included in the time. GCP, though, you can't, because you pay for time for a virtual machine. But if you get a premium image, like say a Red Hat Enterprise Edition image or a Windows Server image, you're paying for that image on top of what you're paying for time. It's kind of like the difference between going to the store and getting tax charged and seeing the tax versus going to, say, the gas station and the tax being included. And I apologize if anybody outside the US is on this call, because these examples are very US based. But okay, so Azure Functions. Azure Functions are work, but it could be storage or time, depending on how you choose to implement it. And storage. Route 53, so that's the DNS service for AWS. You're paying for time and for work. So to have a hosted zone, that is a zone where you have your DNS hosted, your domains hosted, you have to pay per hour for that. But you also have to pay for each DNS record lookup. And they're big bulks of it. It's not expensive. It might be a couple cents for every million requests, but you're paying 2 different kinds of cost models on that. Kinesis. I mentioned Kinesis earlier. You're paying for transport for the stream. You're paying for the Kinesis appliance for being up, so that's time. And then you're also paying for work, because the it may be taking that data and transforming it, doing some kind of ETL on it before it puts it where the destination is. So combinations, this really ups the complexity with cost. And understanding what these cost models are applied to what services you're using, very, very, very critical if you want to have accurate forecasting on the costs. So you say, well, Daniel, this is a little bit overwhelming. There's so many services in AWS. I can hardly name what they are. There's so many services in Azure, I can hardly name what they are. GCP, there's a lot also. How do I even have a framework to begin to think about how these costs are distributed and what they are? Well, I created this cost chart a long time ago, and this is kind of a basic rule of thumb for costs in AWS, and it's pretty spot on for other services too. So in general, networking infrastructure is almost always free. So you can put together a virtual network and have security groups and VPC, security groups for firewall, your virtual network, big CIDR block, your subnets that a division of your virtual network, your routes on how everything's routed, and even your out to the internet's free. There's exceptions to that. I mentioned a NAT gateway earlier. If you have to use a NAT gateway, it is not free, because the NAT gateway is an appliance that translates addresses from private subnet to the internet. So it is not free, and you would actually have to pay for it. But computing. So computing, you usually pay for time, for how long the virtual machine's running, storage for how many gigabytes, and transport. Let's look at some of these things. Generally, internal traffic's usually free. Sort of. If it's inside the VPC, it's always free. So it's inside your network, it's free. Traffic to another availability zone, traffic for load balancer, out. Traffic to another region, all that stuff could cost money. Usually traffic coming in is almost always free. Traffic going out, usually not free. So for things like S3, EBS, AWS backup, EFS, I mean, storage is something that's usually applied to the model. Though I think Elastic File System, EFS, actually has computing to it too, because I think there's a cost associated with the file system hosting, basically a network file system host. Okay, so the services that you build or manage, they're free usually. The monitoring is almost always a work and storage thing. You're taking logs and you're ingesting them somewhere and you're storing them. And things like Lambda are always work, queuing systems, notifications, API gateway, those are almost always a work thing. So you pay per task done, per work unit. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the ways they really get you on cost. Okay, so these are the basic ways they get you on cost. Idle resources running. If you have a virtual machine that is running and it is not being used, they're still going to charge you for it. You're going to say, well, we really didn't use that server. It's not something, it doesn't matter. You provisioned it for a set, for the time that you wanted to provision it for, and you kept it running when you could have shut it off. So you're getting paid for it. I think the convoluted rules on the data transport pricing is something that really gets under my skin a little bit. The fact that I can have a database that's running in one region or one availability zone, and it could be that my web application that is, they could have same, they could be within the same network, but because they're running in different places, I get an associated cost with the data moving between those places. And the fact that the data costs aren't exactly real clear, they're hard to forecast. Yeah, I don't like it. Okay, so the charging different amounts for different kinds of storage, I mentioned that. You just need to be aware of what each kind of storage costs and be aware that there's a difference. Managed services. Okay, let's talk about managed services for a second. Well, actually, yeah, let's talk about managed services. So with AWS and Azure and all these things, so the smart thing is not to just take your existing data center and migrate it over to cloud. The smart thing is to use services that they have put together to make the lift a little bit easier. So everybody's moving to microservices now. Oh, microservices, that's kind of the big thing now, right? If you were doing something like microservices, you might be using Lambda, for instance, for service. So you have a function that does one thing most of the time, and it's written in something like Python or JavaScript or whatever, and it gets executed many times. Well, what does it actually run on? Well, we don't know. It's just you have this code and it runs in this serverless environment. Managed services are great because you don't have to manage the underlying resources with them. Things like platform as a service, software as a service. You can kind of just do what you need to do with the minimum amount of effort and get what you want out of those services. However, managed services are almost always more expensive than building your own, at least from a raw cost standpoint. You can argue that I didn't have to have an ops guy to manage these services, manage these solutions. We didn't have to spend time to actually develop these things. So it's still cheaper. That's correct. But it's just like the difference between, say, making a pizza from scratch versus, buying a pre-made pizza from, Pizza Hut or something like that, or buying a frozen pizza. It's probably more expensive to buy something that's already pre-assembled than it is to, or let's nix the pizza, maybe a little bit, but let's say a sandwich. Okay, you go to Subway to get a sandwich. The sandwich is probably going to be more expensive than it would be for you to make a sandwich at home, but it's definitely more convenient for sure. Okay, so the other thing they really get you on is the easy access with no constraints. When you had your own data center, when you built your own data center, you had a certain amount of resources that were available, and you would give the developers a block of resources and say, go build what you want to build in this constraint of these resources. However, with the cloud, there's really no constraint at all, except what it's going to cost you. And because it's a model that it is not a prepaid model, it's a pay for it after you use it model, you could get yourself in a bad place in a hurry, because you could go and provision a lot of resources. Maybe you have somebody that's hijacked your your AWS account, and they're wanting to use your AWS resources for Bitcoin mining or something like that. You could be stuck with a huge bill. And AWS is pretty good about working with people that have had, say, a hacker or somebody hack it, or if it's their first time and they've gotten hit with these big bills, they're usually pretty good at working with people. But just having this wide open, no constraints kind of, here's all the computing resources you'd ever want, what do you want to do? That tends to get people in trouble. It's much like the college students that got the credit card with the $5,000, $10,000 limit, after having no money, like, oh my gosh, I could do some real damage with this. That's pretty much how the cloud services are, in my opinion. Okay, so let's talk about, what do you do? I mean, okay, so you've talked about a lot of things, Daniel. What exactly do you do? Know yourself and know your provider. So you need to be pretty connected with your provider and know what your provider provides. And you really know what you need to know, what you have and what you're trying to do. Are you trying to host a Java application? Are you trying to host something in Angular, with a Java backend? Or, do you have a database? Those kind of things you need to optimize for your cloud provider. If you know certain services are kind of expensive and they'll cost you a lot, then maybe you try to go a different direction with the services. Maybe you don't do managed services. Plan. So come up with a good plan. Know what you're doing before you start moving stuff over. Don't be like the executives that I've talked to before that said, we just need to move everything into AWS and we'll figure out the cost later. That's not a good idea if you want to keep your bills at a reasonable level. Forecast. So I think getting a nice baseline and then starting to forecast what things will cost, that's a good place to start going with it. Revisit your monthly bills. So I would go back and look and see what those costs are, and look if there's any outliers, anything particular that you think, oh, we probably shouldn't have spent that much money on that. Why's the problem? What's the problem? What are we doing? One thing I should have put on the last slide was logging. So let me go back to it real quick. Another way that they get you on this is AWS is in particular, and Azure might be the same. They're very insistent on getting you to log virtually everything. And that's a good way for them to make more and more and more money. But I would say you don't log it unless you need to log it, unless there's a reason to log it, unless you're trying to figure out something. Don't log it. So that, I think that's another way they get you on cost. Okay. So also look at the cloud cost provider tools. So there are some in AWS that are good ones, cost calculators, budget caps. Budget caps are good. So putting in a budget cap so your team can only spend $2,000. Put that in, as soon as that money's up, oh, you can't spend anymore. Usage reports, you can go look at those, figure those out. The cloud providers have some good tools for these, but there are also some good third-party provider tools. There's one that I was experimenting with called InfraCost. It's INFRACOST. I think it's called InfraCost. And it's something that you can embed in your Terraform if you're using Terraform to build AWS code or whatever, and it'll tell you what the pricing is of everything. I can't 100% endorse it yet because there's been some funny things happen with it, but it's one worth taking a look at, I think. Also, I don't have a slide for this, but I think you need to have some idea about FinOps. Okay, so FinOps. Can I write on here? Maybe. Yeah, let's do it. Let's see. Okay. Hey, I'm gonna write on here. Nice. Oh, this is ugly. This is gonna be great. Sorry, guys. Beautiful. Oh, that's gorgeous. Still better than my handwriting. Okay, so FinOps. Let's talk a little bit about that. Okay, so everybody that hasn't been in a cave knows what Agile is. Agile is basically the relationship between the business and the development team, right? It's business needs something coded. How do we get that requirement to the development team? Most people have heard the term DevOps. What is DevOps? DevOps is a relationship between the development team and the operations team. And this is how we deploy code. This is how we do things. This is how we get it out there. This is how we be successful. This is how we automate. Okay. So what is FinOps? FinOps is a relationship between the business and the operations team. And it's really about getting together to understand what it's going to cost for particular, and FinOps is mostly developed for the cloud. What is it going to cost in the cloud? So we need to talk through this. We need to figure out what it costs. We need to have some visibility on it. Basically, it's just about, so there's an organization called, it's like finops.org, I believe, is the website, and they have some good material on it. They have some certifications. I don't know if it's worth getting a certification in this yet, but look, the Agile, DevOps, and FinOps, they're all about just talking. Are you having these conversations in your organization? Are you talking about what it's going to cost to the business as the person building it? Have you talked to the development team as the person building it of what it's going to cost to run their code? And maybe they need to do some things differently to make it cost less to run the code. Have those conversations. I think that's the biggest thing you can do as far as controlling costs is know what it's going to be, have those conversations, and hopefully things will turn out better. Okay. How do I get rid of this little pointer here? Hold on a second. Oh, I don't want to erase that. I guess. Very nice. Okay, well, let's just do this. Let's just go to the next slide because the next slide is, that's it. Are there any questions? Anything I can answer on this topic to try to get an idea of how to think about cloud costs? The forecasting of it, that's kind of another presentation, but Maris, do we have any questions? Anybody?
Let me check in the chat. No. In Q&A. No.
Well, I think what it looks like is it looks like I've covered everything perfectly, so since there's no questions. So
Oh, we have a raised hand.
okay. Yes. I don't know. Can they talk, or do you have to?
I think.
Hi.
Hey.
Hey, well, thanks for unmuting me. I have only maybe like one or two questions, if it's okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. So I manage cloud in my environment, and kind of the environment that I run, we're actually just moving to cloud. And thanks for highlighting some pitfalls on what we're going to encounter. This spells like doom. But we're going to manage this one way or the other. But my question is, we are kind of not, we will not be able to avoid going to cloud because the reason behind us going to cloud is to make sure the business runs smoothly and also to avoid downtime and high availability, which we are not enjoying on-prem because of the part of the world that we are. I'm joining this presentation from Africa. So class seems to be the way. So my question is there any way we can manage this to save cost apart from the solution that you have given to us, that maybe moving gradually is one way, and also being able to monitor the costs. But that's it. I don't think, is there any other way that you can suggest, especially for us? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the question. So I actually had a discussion with my brother-in-law. He's a PhD candidate at Georgia Tech, so he's really smart. And I was having a conversation with him about this presentation that I was going to give today, and he, it was frustrating to me when he started asking questions about it, because not because of his questions being bad, but because I felt very powerless to give him a decent answer on it. That really is upsetting to me. So okay, so the thing is if you're moving from an on-premise data center to AWS and you're trying to think, well, what is this actually going to cost? I don't have a real good answer for you on that. It's a little bit infuriating and a little bit upsetting that we can't do that I can't come up with an answer. I think the best you have is if you're on an on-premise data center, you have a lot of control over your over the network activity and what's happening, and all of the traffic that you're getting. So if you have pretty good records on what that's going to be, then you can start to figure out, well, what is it going to be in the cloud? And it might be, so one of the things that I found in cloud migration is that you may have a super big server on premise that you're using for a thing, and you maybe want to downsize a little bit when you go into the cloud, but you don't want to downsize too much because then you won't be able to run it. So what I would do is so you mentioned kind of a scaled approach. I think a scaled approach is always a good idea to, that is, move a little bit at a time, carve out services and pieces and figure out a way to get them running in the cloud first, and then slowly move everything off premise. That's probably the least risky thing to do that. I think I would look at trying to use some of those managed services. I didn't mean to be so down on managed services. I think managed services are great. It's just they can be costly, and you just need to know what they cost, because you don't want to have to build everything from scratch. And doing a lift and shift doesn't really take advantage of the cloud. It does take advantage of those things that you mentioned, the cloud resiliency, that is availability, is it going to be up, those kind of things. But using the managed services, and particularly the cloud specific services, that really gives you the power to do more. But just use them wisely. Just be very tempered in how you use them. I think that's the best you can hope for. I mean, at least from me. There may be people out there that have better ideas than I do, but I think I think moving a little bit and seeing how it goes. I would get familiar with the pricing of any of the resources that you're using. So if you're using EC2 instances, say you're using virtual machines, I would go figure out what the pricing is. And I'd go figure out, well, if we put this on there, how much load is it using? Or is it asleep, or is it about to crumble because we have too much load on it? We need to go up or down on the cost, I mean, on the size of it. But yeah, any service that you're touching that you say, okay, we're going to use this, this, and this, go look at the pricing, figure out what the pricing is. Try to understand how to construct a pricing model before you move. I hope I answered your question halfway decent. My goodness.
Yeah, you really do. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. The second question is, I'm sorry to waste your time.
No, you're not
Is
wasting my time. I appreciate this, by the way. Thank you.
all right, all right. So I don't know. Are you familiar with this? Because there are a lot of cloud hyperscalers that will be preaching different solutions to us, like Azure cloud stack, for example. So, are you familiar with that in such a way that you have a kind of rebuilt cloud infrastructure on locally on our environment that will give us a kind of look and feel of what is running on AWS cloud uh, um, or Microsoft cloud, but the infrastructure is going to be on our data center. Is it? I just want to ask if you're familiar with it. Is it a good investment? Is it something that we can venture into?
I don't think I can properly speak to that. I wish I could. But I think so. You're talking about like a hybrid solution, right? Where you got
something like that. Yeah,
where you got assets in the cloud, but also assets on prem. So I'll be honest with you. Most of the solutions that I've worked on have been people going all out to moving to the cloud. The hybrid solutions, and I think there are a lot of people that there's people in certain businesses and particular things like government and stuff that are wanting to do the hybrid solution. But most of the projects I've worked on have been like, we need to get completely out and into the cloud. There are reasons for having that. I don't know enough about your business and everything to tell you, to give you good advice on whether you should, how you should manage that and whether you want to manage that. Yeah, I wish I could tell you more, but I don't want to wade in too much on that because I'm not sure. So
of course, I understand. Thanks a lot. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, I saw a question pop up on the thing. Maris, is there another question?
Oh. Yes, we have another in the Q&A. Is there any kind of checklist that we can use to predict what will be our initial goals before start a project?
Okay, so yeah, that's a good question. So let's see. So I'd mentioned, oh man, that would be, You know, I I don't know off the top of my head if there's a really good checklist for that, but I would try to take an inventory of what you think you're going to need on the project. So if you were doing, I mentioned something like this. If you were doing, say, a Java application and you knew that you were going to run it in a container and you were going to have a front end that was running Angular, I would engineer my solution in AWS, and then I would go and say, okay, I know I'm using this service. I know I'm using CloudFront. I'm using S3. I'm using Elastic Container Service with Fargate. I would go through those things, and then I would say, what are these things cost? And what are the cost models on them? So I would use oh, and by the way, I'm going to post this presentation. No, I'm not going to, but I'm going to give my slides to Maris, and she's going to post them somewhere, right? Is that correct, Maris? Or is that possible?
This presentation is in YouTube.
Is what? I'm sorry.
In YouTube.
Yeah, well, the slides, we're gonna be able
Oh,
to
yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So I think we're going to be able to post the slides somewhere. But anyway, I would look at these cost models that I was talking about and just try to at least identify what those services, identify the services, I think would be your the things you want to do. So from a checklist standpoint, what services are using? If you can't figure out what those services are that you're using, you're using VPC, using EC2, or using ECS? Figure out what those services are. And then the second step is figure out what those services are going to cost you. Because for the most part, you can kind of figure out 90% what your cost is. The trickiest thing is going to be things like storage and traffic. Unless you're getting a tremendous amount of traffic, the traffic issue, a cost is probably not going to kill you. And if you're getting a lot of traffic, that probably means your business is doing well. And if your business is doing well, you can probably pay for it. But it's going to be the fixed cost, mostly like how much does it cost to run this database? How much does it cost to run this this EC2, this virtual machine? Those are going to be your big things. A lot of the other things are going to be smaller costs. I'd say if you're working on a checklist, focus on the big things. Focus on the things that cost the most, because those are going to be where you can make the most gain. There's going to be a couple little things that you get cost, you may get a couple dollars or something, or, whatever currency you're using for something like S3. But the big services, the big things, those are what's going to kill you on costs. These are good questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time, and thank you, Daniel, for this amazing presentation. And that's all for today.
Thank you so much for producing this, Maris. I appreciate that. And everybody have a good one. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.